Now, we have covered so far in looking at the Bible arcing method the logical relationships of series, progression, alternative. We've covered action manner, comparison, negative positive, idea explanation, question and answer, and then also ground and inference. And so I want to walk through a few examples of what it looks like to arc using just these logical relationships. We're going to cover more logical relationships as we continue in the Bible arcing method, but I want to practice and give some examples of what this looks like when we begin looking at more than just one sentence or one verse of Scripture. What happens when we start stacking up several propositions? Because although, as I've said, arcing in itself is fairly simple and straightforward, the more propositions we stack up, the more complex this becomes, and the harder it becomes, the more difficult it becomes to follow the flow of an author's thought. So let's look at this example in Hebrews chapter 7, verses 23 to 25. Hebrews 7, 23 to 25. The former priests were many in number because they were prevented by death from continuing in office, but he holds his priesthood permanently because he continues forever. Consequently, he is able to save to the uttermost those who draw near to God through him, since he always lives to make intercession for them. So we've defined our passage, verses 23 to 25, and we want to read through this and begin to identify the individual propositions so that we can set them out and begin to define the relationships between them. So the first proposition is here: the former priests were many in number. Former priests were many in number. This is the first verbal assertion. And then we have a key word, because, which points us to the relationship of ground. And to the second proposition, they were prevented by death from continuing in office. So first proposition, the former priests were many in number. Second, they were prevented by death from continuing in office. But, another key word, pointing us probably to the relationship of alternative, he holds his priesthood permanently. He holds his priesthood permanently, a third verbal assertion, a third proposition, because he continues forever. Another proposition, he continues forever, period. Consequently, here's a key word that can point us to one of the relationships. He is able to save to the uttermost those who draw near to God through him. Now, you may be tempted here to divide this into a couple of propositions, but I would warn against it here. Consequently, he is able to save to the uttermost those who draw near. So we have the verb save, he's able to save, and we also have the verb draw near. Those who draw near, who take this action. However, this second verb, draw near, really is pointing back to those whom he is able to save. He is able to save to the uttermost those, and then who draw near to God through him is part of that noun phrase, pointing us and filling out the definition of who those people are. Those who draw near to God through him. So I would keep this as all one proposition. And then this brings us to the word since, which is another key word. He always lives to make intercession for them. He always lives to make intercession for them. Our final proposition. So let's look at these laid out parallel to each other so we can begin to identify and diagram this relationship. I've gone ahead and written out in full these propositions as they appear to save a little bit of time here. The former priests, this is our first proposition, were many in number. Second, because they were prevented by death from continuing in office, comma, but he holds his priesthood permanently, comma, because he continues forever. Consequently, he is able to save to the uttermost those who draw near to God through him. I'm keeping this all in this one proposition. Since he always lives to make intercession for them. So let's label these propositions so we can begin to define the relationship between them. This begins with verse 23, and verse 24 begins with but, and verse 25 begins with consequently. 25. So we have 23a, b, 24a, b, 25a, b. Actually, a nice, neat layout here. So we draw our line. I like to do it on the left side. If you want to do it on the right side or above, as I've demonstrated in another video, you can do that. But I'm going to draw one arc over every proposition so that we can begin to define the relationships between them. The former priests were many in number because they were prevented by death from continuing in office. So we see here this keyword because, which points us to the relationship of ground. This is the reason that the priests were many in number, because they were prevented by death from continuing in office. So I think he's making a connection here of 23a and b, the ground for proposition A found in proposition B, before we move on to verse 24. So I'm going to label that as the ground for 23a. And then I'm going to move on to 24a and b to see if there is something similar, because it looks like to me that there's a similar construction happening here. Something that's true and the reason for it, but he holds his priesthood permanently, something that's true and the reason for it, because he continues forever, because his life is without end. And so we have a second ground here in 24a and b. And I want to arc the relationship within this sentence. 23 and 24 comprise one sentence here before moving on to verse 25, which is a second sentence. You always want to finish the relationships, the arcs within one sentence before crossing over to the next sentence. So our keyword here between 23a and b and 24ab is the word but. There's a contrast, there's an alternative happening here. The former priests were many in number because they died, but he never dies. He holds his priesthood permanently here. So we have an alternative relationship. So I'm going to label this as an alternative and draw one arc over 23 and 24. And then I'm going to look down at verse 25. Consequently, he is able to save to the uttermost those who draw near to God through him, since he always lives to make intercession for them. Since is our key word here within this sentence, connecting A and B, and points us to the relationship of ground. It's like for or because. And so I'm going to label this as a ground. It's the reason why he is able to save to the uttermost. Certainly a truth that should give us great hope and bring us to our knees, that he is able to save to the uttermost. The reason for that is because he always lives to make intercession for them. He cannot die, and so his intercession continues uninterrupted. And then we need to look at the relationship between 23:24 and verse 25 now. And the connection we see, the key word that we see here, is consequently, which points us to the relationship of inference, And so I'm going to label this final arc with the symbol for therefore, the symbol for inference, and then I'm going to draw one arc over the top to bring all these arcs under one thought. And we see that then we have an alternative of the former priests contrasted with the priesthood of Jesus, which continues forever. And then the inference or the implication of that in verse 25, because he continues forever, therefore he is able to save to the uttermost, since he always lives to make intercession for them. And this is an example of arcing, using those relationships that we've covered so far. Hebrews chapter 7, verses 23 to 25.